Your time today. This morning, I wanted to share some techniques for observing your stakeholders. And the reason why this is really important to me is that I feel that bridging the gap between what people say and what they do is really dependent upon how well we observe our stakeholders. So, one of the things that I've learned over the years is that personal behaviors truly are the foundations of a lot of our project risk. It's people who control the access to resources. Until robots come, people are responsible for executing the tasks in our projects. And ultimately, it's people that will accept or reject our change. So, the hypothesis I have is that the reason why there's a gap between what people say and what they do, it's a result of the current environment not supporting the change. And when I say environment, I'm really talking about the cultural environment, the norms and behaviors that are supported or punished in any given culture. And I found that the success or failure of projects hinge on my ability to accurately discern pockets of support and potential models. Also, seeing whether the existing reward structures are going to help our efforts and determine the probability that people do what they say they're going to do based on that information. So I've found that ethnographic observation is a really good way to get a feel for the culture of the product that your project is working within. And ethnographic observation really is observing people and people's behaviors. And you might have heard some of this already in design thinking. When designers go out and look at personas, they're using a number of techniques from ethnographic observation. We're doing this a little bit differently with an eye towards stakeholder management. The other thing I've found is it's a really good way to spend a little bit of time in meetings that you might not be leading to get a little bit more information about the environment that your culture is embedded within at that particular moment. So the way I approach this is through four basic steps. And the first one, which we'll spend a lot of our time on, will be on getting clear on yourself and how you're walking into that observation. And the second is defining the question. And we'll speak a little bit to that, but it helps to go in with intent. And having a specific question that you're trying to ask keeps you somewhat focused. And also, since you're still probably taking notes on the meeting about the standard project activities that we typically keep track of, having an area of focus on the side is going to really help. The third is actually observing the environment, and I'll provide some tips for that. And then finally, leveraging your findings. How do you use what you've learned to help your project? So I'm going to go ahead and start with knowing yourself. And there's really three things that, when I look at knowing yourself, it's really about surfacing what assumptions you're going in with, what biases you have, and the motive that you're using when you're walking into a meeting or you're even doing your project. What are your motives? So I'm going to start with assumptions. And the big question here is, what do you expect to find? Many times, it's really easy to go into a situation with particular expectations. I have found that writing down my expectations up front gives me a platform to then separate those expectations and allows me to question some of the assumptions that I'm bringing to the table. As an example, let's say I've been working in an environment for a really long time. And I am trying to implement a new tool, and I'm about to go speak to the help desk manager. That help desk manager has a history of resisting all the other implementations. If I write down the assumption that he's going to resist this one too because of past behavior, at least I can see it. This really isn't too far from the practice of surfacing assumptions when we're performing early risk management evaluations, particularly in the initiation and planning stage. And I have also found that it's very important for those of us who've been working with the same people for many years. So the invitation is to see, hey, are we wrong this time? But knowing what assumptions you're going in with is critical. The second invitation is surfacing what are your personal biases. What would you prefer to see as you go into this meeting or you go into this conversation? I know I have something I jokingly call Wendy's Utopian Fantasyland, and my judgment is, boy, if I see something that's organized and under control and that's been well planned, it's awesome. These are the things that I want to see, and these are the things I categorize as good. Again, it's really good to write down what those biases are so that you can question them. The big trick with some of this is to be able to suspend a little bit of judgment. And we're going to be evaluating later, and then judgment is helpful. But as you're doing the observation, detachment is going to be very helpful. But I will speak to that a little bit shortly. The final one is motive. Why are you making this observation? And this might change during the course of a project or if you're trying to do something in particular. So are you trying to embed with the team? Are you trying to figure out those norms so you can better build trust? Or are you trying to make a major change and you're just trying to figure out what you've got to work with? What is motivating what you're doing? And this is a really important question. So here, I chose the picture more because of the people, not because it has any meaning, but there's a spectrum, and I'm going to move my slide over here, that anthropologists use called the observer-participant spectrum. So on one side of that spectrum is the observer. And an extreme version of that is, if you think of the missionaries, I will inflict my solution on you. There is an advantage to being an observer in that you have perspective, you're questioning what's going on, and you also typically are going in with the knowledge of alternative outcomes or alternative behaviors or ways that things could potentially be different. On the other side of the spectrum is the participant. And an extreme version of that is, I'm doing my best to fit in, and you're not really questioning the norms. But there's an advantage to this side too. You're building trust with the people within that culture. And also with that trust, you're able to gain a deeper understanding of what's happening, particularly things like, unspoken norms. There's no right area in that spectrum. There are, however, ways that we can leverage that continuum and move within it, moving in and out based on our needs. So I talk a little bit about detachment. That's not always necessarily optimal, but it is a very important tool. And there's ways we can leverage this continuum during different points of our practice. So like in initiation and planning, you may find yourself a little bit more towards the observer end of the spectrum, as you're trying to get a feel for what's going on. If you're at a point where you're trying to get the team to work optimally, you may wind up being more on the participant end of the spectrum. Where you land at any given moment as you go into your observation really is dependent upon, again, your motive. Why are you making this observation? Also your circumstances. Someone who's going in as a consultant to give advice is more likely going to wind up in the observer side of the spectrum than your individual contributors or you having been embedded in an organization for a long time. You're more likely to be on the participant side of the spectrum, and that's okay. And then there's also natural inclinations. Some of us are, derive great joy from just hanging out and watching. Others derive joy from fitting in. So it's you're going to wind up moving there, but in that spectrum. But the big point and takeaway for this section, for all of this, is that in that spectrum, you're not stuck in one place and there is no optimum. The only ask is that you are aware of what you're trying to accomplish. So now that you have an idea of your assumption, biases, and motives, the next key is to define your question. And Christina Eng, in her really great book, Watching Closely, where she goes into like deep detail of how to do ethnographic observation, she recommends doing one question per observation encounter. And you can use that same question across multiple encounters. And so again, when I'm talking observation encounters, I'm thinking meetings, I'm thinking one-on-one conversations, or even time I set aside to just go, okay, what's going on here? An example of this is looking at a question surrounding cultural norms, like trying to figure out cultural norms. Another really good example is figuring out a network map, who's talking to who and who's got influence with who. In this case, I'm going to speak a little bit more about cultural norms. Here, what I'm trying to figure out is what behaviors am I seeing most frequently. So some examples are preferred modes of communication. And for many of us, we've been able to really see this writ large in our current circumstances. How are people reaching out to you? And how are they reaching out to each other? Is it all like instant messenger and they're instant messaging each other all the time? Phone calls? Are they using emails, Slack? Is it a culture where people try to get in touch with you using any modality they can get their hands on? What's the norm? What's typical response time? What are the active hours? Are you seeing more activity in the morning with this group of people? Are you seeing more activity in the afternoon? Are people reaching you 24/7? And then there's other levels, such as what's the reaction to vacations, leave, and sick time? But the key here is to go in with an intent of just observing the behavior, and you don't really need to figure out why they're behaving that. So the next step is actually observing your environment. And the invite here is to embed this within your current processes. You're taking notes on what you see and not just what you hear. I know that it's very easy just to focus on the content of the conversation, but there's a lot of other physical activities and behaviors that you can observe. And it's not simply, when you're in a meeting and looking at body language, but it's even something as simple as, are people using video or not? How are people calling in? Is everybody muting or not? Is there a particular group of people that's muting and then others that aren't? So there's many other things that you can observe, even if you've taken out the variable of your office space. The next tip is to decide on a coding mechanism. The stakeholder management, I've found it often advisable to keep the information in your stakeholder management matrix private. And the same thing applies here too. So having a coding mechanism is really helpful. And those of us also with really terrible handwriting, like myself, kind of run at an advantage here, particularly when we're all in one place and in a meeting. When it comes to coding, I'm talking about things like, okay, What's the code for this person is this person's boss? What's the code for, um, does there appear to be hostility or do they appear to be friendly? What's the code for, where they're sitting in around a table? Is there any importance in the positioning? It depends on the types of questions that you're choosing to ask. The field behind this is qualitative ethnographic analysis. And eventually, as you do more of these observations, you'll start discerning some patterns, and then you can code based on those patterns. Again, be open to multiple observation sessions on the same question. And then the final tip, it's staying focused on your question, but being open to all activity. And here's what I mean about this. So let's say that I'm really interested in trying to discern some cultural norms around how people are currently using their phones. But I'm seeing a lot of traffic around a particular instant messaging tool. And I'm going to use WebEx Teams, for example, simply because we're on WebEx events. So I'm still staying focused on the question, but that might be really important later. So if something's catching my eye as interesting, I would typically pay attention to that as well. Because I do find that at a certain point, it's like, that's really important, and I might be able to either leverage this behavior or have to ask some questions about this behavior. Now, one of the things with this approach is that I don't see it as like replacing or adding. It's really more about embedding a slightly different perspective into the things that we already do as project managers. I find the stakeholder matrix being a really powerful tool for that. So you can add columns based on what you're observing, or if you're trying to get a network grid, column of okay, who has his ear and who is he ignoring, and what are their positions. And you can also, if you identify any typical behaviors, you can have a behavior column. So you can leverage that, and then particularly as you start looking at patterns and discerning patterns, you can then, for those of us who really love Excel, you can then start sorting and sifting based off of how you've coded things. And in the presentation deck, at the last slide of the deck, I am going to provide a few really good resources, particularly for things like how to code and how to analyze what you found. So the final step is leveraging your findings. And as part of this, there's really two items. One is finding the patterns that you have discovered as you've done your observations and gone to these meetings and you've watched. And the other is determining the size of the gap and what your destination point is, and making sure that's well defined so you can see how big that change is. And then from there, you can determine what's around already that can serve as seeds for that change. You can discern any trends that will impact your project and impact the success of your change. And you can also start evaluating whether or not the reward structures that are in place will help or hurt the change that your project is trying to make. So let's talk a little bit about patterns. And the big question I have when I start evaluating patterns is what seems to be the default. Here, I'm asking you to look at that on a few levels. And I've identified 3 common ones, but it's going to be dependent on the stakeholders in your project. You do want to try to get an organization-wide definition of your default. What's your most common patterns across the entire organization, however you've decided to define organization, whether it is the entire company, whether it's a building of the company. It's dependent upon who your stakeholders are and who's going to be impacted by the change, which admittedly is often bigger than we think. The next is at the team level. And this is, and it's either your team or like a team of stakeholders that are going to be impacted by your change. Like, if you've got a collections of power users, discerning what their patterns are individually. And then you do have the individual level, which is where we often, at least I've often spent most of my stakeholder management time, is discerning individual patterns, particularly among key stakeholders that we need to have their support. That can be very important, but I invite you to also consider the context that they're working in, because we are all impacted by the cultural context that we find ourselves in, often whether we like it or not. That whole adage of you are the combination of the five people you spend most of your time with, I found to be pretty accurate. So one of the questions I ask when I look at patterns, and particularly when I start breaking it down between teams and individuals, is whether or not there are norms among a particular team that differs from the broader pattern. And this is something that we can leverage to the benefit of our project if the behaviors and the norms that we're seeing in that team are helpful. It's also the same way to identify detractors as well. I think a lot of us do this unconsciously, but I think it's really helpful. The second is, what do you need them to do? So making sure that you've spent the time defining the pattern that you need to see for your change to stick. And there's a couple of really important points here. One is you're able to see how big that gap is between what is currently going on and what you need them to do. The second is you can see whether or not the rewards are helpful and determine what it is, what behaviors it is that need to be reinforced. So, I mean, essentially you're defining your endpoint, you're defining your goal, and then you can work your way towards that goal. And this is an old education adage. And so let's use our current circumstances as an example. Many people at the universities and the school systems had to go to online learning really quickly as a result of our current coronavirus. And if you are starting in an environment where almost everybody there is a classroom teacher, it's going to be a lot trickier than if you're in an environment where half of them are very comfortable with online learning and half of them are classroom. And there's two reasons for why that gap's smaller. One is that you've already got champions who can mentor those who now find themselves in this new environment in a way that if it's all classroom focused instructors, you might not have. And then the second is that you've got someone who's already modeling the behavior. So even if there's not direct mentoring, they've got someone they can look at that's right close at hand. And having that person close at hand makes it feel more doable. Really here, it's looking at how radical the change you're making is, and also trying to identify the behavior, skills, and resources that are already there that you can amplify. So the idea is to make that gap smaller by really identifying what it is that you already have that can help you. So that's what I meant by seeds. The second is looking at trends, and it's, will the environment support the change that you're making? And there is a question, approaches for managing upper management. They are part of the environment, and are they going to support the change that you're making? Depending on where they are at and the level that they're at, this is where observation helps. Because what you're trying to do is discern what's in it for them. Figuring out who their network is. You might need to do an end around. It's not a great, not the optimal approach, but it sometimes needs to happen. Are they interested in progress? And are they in an environment where they're either, are they in an environment that's going to support the change that they want to make? Are you in an environment that's going to support the change that you want to make? And is there something happening in the broader world that might impact it either positively or negatively? So I'm going to, because instructional technology is kind of my background, in many respects, having everybody forced to work from home, has been quite the boon. And it's not something that was predicted. And frankly, there was, a lot of resistance, and some of it, purposeful and needed resistance. But it's amazing how quickly people were able to act soon afterwards. So, and people changed their mind really quick. So this is why I talk a little bit about what's the context that your upper management's in. What behavior patterns are you seeing both with them, but also with where they're embedded? And is there something that you can do to help them? Because that's, at the end of the day, that's kind of what it's about, not necessarily how they can support your change, although that's important, but how you can help them as well. And is there a way that your change is going to positively impact them? If your change is going to have a negative impact on their lives, they're in a stickier situation. I hope that helps. The other thing is taking a look at the behaviors that are rewarded or punished in the environment. And again, your upper management does have a lot of say in that. And I will admit, this is often a very sticky situation and a sticky conversation to have. And the best way that I've found to have this conversation is to approach it by what behaviors do you want to see in your environment and what are you rewarding? And surfacing whether or not there's a conflict in that. And then figuring out ways to support them, because there's a change that needs to happen there too. So there's some certain questions, but part of it's just analyzing, what needs to happen. Do rewards and punishment and reinforcement need to change? So, for instance, if you've got an initiative where you're trying to put together a more remote workplace, is visibility rewarded over outcomes currently? Are people being rewarded for showing up and being at their desk? That's going to be, the attendance award, for instance. That's going to be tough. If the management is willing to change that into something else, that's great. Is availability rewarded over effectiveness? Again, that's a tricky one. First, it's a matter of availability is easy to measure. What does effective look like? So defining what that is. Again, matching the reinforcement with what it is that you're trying to do. Now, for something like an upgrade, that's pretty simple. Use a new tool. But if it's something that, it's a major change, I did from paper to electronic medical records, that's a huge change. So it is going to require, a different reward structure. So those are the findings. Or, excuse me, not the findings. It's the four steps that I have. First, know yourself. Second, make sure that you've defined your questions. So both of those speak to intent and the lens within which you are looking at this engagement. Third, spending time observing your environment. is all very important for making sure that you're clear on the environmental, the cultural context that your project is in. And then finally, evaluate and leverage your findings. Where are you at now? Where do you need to be? What behaviors do you need to see? And then how big is that gap? So that is the presentation. Okay, so I see that Dawn has
excellent. Thank you very much, Wendy.
Mm-hmm.
So perfect timing. We have one question that came from Don Fixner. And the question is, what are some approaches for managing upper-level stakeholders whom you never interact with, but whose decisions, opinions, and preferences directly impact your project?
How do you bubble up your project's needs against other priorities? So that's a really good question. And I will admit that I have not found a particularly good answer to that. To me, it's been very key that if there is a project that's important to me, that it needs to be in alignment with the greater mission of the organization. And I've run into this a few times, particularly with some of my learning management projects. One example is trying to get some substantive reporting and integration with some of our enterprise solutions, so I could see not just the typical, okay, how many people attended and, what was the, how did they like it sort of scores, but also, okay, at the end of the class, now and later, how did that impact business performance? So for instance, are they using, if I'm looking at metrics around, are they using, say, a particular solution more? Do I have access to those metrics? Easier or harder, I find that having allies is very helpful. Having people who can guide me towards better aligning the project that I'm in is very helpful. I think finding starting that network map of who has influence with who is also very helpful. So
okay.
That's what I've got there. How do we keep track of what stakeholders are saying before we take these observation steps so that we can identify the gap? Well, part of the observation really is about figuring out where you're at. So where you are right now. In many respects, that's the observation. What is easier to do before the observation steps is figure out what behaviors need to happen. So it almost flips that in terms of, okay, what do I need to have happen? What behaviors do I need to see? Now, here's the observation. What am I actually seeing in the environment? And then I can identify the gap. So I would flip that. Figure out what I need to see, then go see what's there, and then figure out if I've got a match or a mismatch, and then figure out, okay, now what steps do I need to take to bridge it? Hope that helps. Let's see, I'm trying to scroll down a little bit. There you go. Can you repeat the book on observations? Oh, the book on observations is Christina Eng, NG. The book is called Watching Closely. Great book. I've also got it listed at the end of my presentation deck, so if they're providing those for download. I'll also make sure, I've got a website, I'll just make sure if it's okay, I'll talk to Miroslav afterwards, but if it's an option, I'll either put the resources by themselves up or I'll put this deck up, and I'm sure that after this conference, they're also going to provide the presentation deck. I hope I'm, is that accurate? Okay. What does the name of my company mean, middle curve? So the technology curve, the technology acceptance curve, you've got your early adopters and then Then you've got the people in the middle. Um, I started a blog way back in 2005 or something like that. That was more focused on people adopting e-learning. This is like super early days. And I was in the middle of a project. And so I called that blog In the Middle of the Curve because many of my friends, professional colleagues outside of the environment I was working in, were very bleeding edge technologists. And I did not work with bleeding edge technologists. I worked with late adopters. And so it was really more of a, hey, let's, that peak, the people who are kind of flipping, it's like, okay, the early adopters have done this, how do I get started? So that's really what the company name is about, is helping people really with adopting tools that, are a little more mature, that they're starting to see that they need them, but, they're not racing into the next new thing. And that's really where my sweet spot is. How do you manage politically driven stakeholders? I guess my big thing is, what can I do to make them look good? What's in it for them? if it comes down to saying, what's in it for them? Who are they trying to impress? How do I make them impressive? That's kind of it's an interesting question, and I'll admit I'm not crazy about politically driven stakeholders, but it is the nature of our work. Best reference works for techniques in stakeholder impact analysis and management. Boy, there's so many. So there's two parts to that. One is impact analysis. I would, in some ways, I'd almost go to some of the design thinking works for some of that, because they do personas, and they do they do a lot of work in sort of what they're doing and then what's going to make their lives better. But there's a flip side to that I don't know that designers go into, and I don't have a great reference for this, which is, okay, what's the negative impact? And let's take some of the automation as an example. So I will take that back because I think that's an interesting question. Stakeholder management, there's a whole bunch of those. The place I tend to start is actually the PMBOK, particularly for project managers. That's a good place to start. And then I will start going into things like, even some of the Dale Carnegie, how to win friends and influence people, because that's fundamentally stakeholder management itself. How do I build relationships, and how do I build trust with particular stakeholders? My bias is very much towards individual relationship. So, but yeah, let me take that back because I think that's an interesting question. Next question. In the Know Yourself section, do we judge our bias and try to adjust? No. Actually, don't judge your bias. Your bias is your bias. It's more of a be clear on it. Like I said, I'm a recovering control freak. I could judge it as I really shouldn't be, or I could judge it as, and this is awesome. Yeah, I mean, you're you. You have your biases. Just know what they are. How do you see the observations in coding shared with upper management? I wouldn't. I would leave it for myself. What I would do is, once I'm ready to present, hey, look, guys, this is what I'm seeing, and this is how this is going to impact your project. what do you think, and being open to the answer. And what are the perils of reacting to observations versus leveraging? And some of that is, okay, so I'm going to break it up into two questions. With the observations, I know a lot of the upper management that I've run into really don't like surprises. So and then part of it's from the observation of how they tend to respond to things that might be bad news or might be unwelcome news. You always couch it in terms of, this is why this is important to make make this project successful. Why there needs to be a bit of shift in behavior to make this project successful. You're also going to get a good feel in terms of how important that project is to them.
Yeah, Wendy, there is time for one more question.
Okay.
And then we'll have to stop at that.
Okay. And if you could send me the other questions I don't get a chance to answer.
Okay, then you can respond directly to the.
Yeah. First, and sometimes we screw up and make the wrong impression with the key stakeholder. Can you share some steps on changing the perception and relationship after the fact? Gee, I'm in the middle of that now with one of my clients, where just, things just have not gone well, and I will admit I've not made the greatest impression. So the best thing that I can do, one, is admit that I've made a mistake and admit my part in getting off on the wrong foot. And then it's more of a, okay, what do I need to do regularly and repetitively to make sure that I'm proving that the stuff that's important to them and the behaviors that I want to show work and repair that relationship? I really think it's on me, and usually the stakeholder will tell me exactly where I screwed up and what they want to see from me in the future. And so it behooves me to make sure that I do those behaviors repetitively, because it's going to take, it takes time. I wish there was a silver bullet for that, but in any relationship, it's going to take time. So yeah, it happens. And that's it.
Okay.
9:45, and I'll take the other questions offline. And thank you.
Yes, there is at least one left over, and that was there's a lot of calls for transformation disruption, but the managerial here often stifles risk-taking creativity. How should we position information leadership to assess if the environment we're in is ready to support the change that say they want? I think that would call for a longer answer.
Yeah, that's a pretty long answer, and just real quickly, some of that is consider pre-changes. Break it down a little bit more, but I can go into that separately.
Okay, thank you so much again, Wendy. Very, very interesting presentation, interesting session. Thank you to all the participants, and our next session starts at 10 o'clock. Thanks again.
Thank you all so much for your time.